March 16th, 2026. We are in the 5th year and on day 21 since the start of the full-scale invasion. Welcome. I greet you to the Situation Report. In today's report, we will take a look at the plans for the Russian offensive for spring 2026, which means right now. We will also look at mutual attacks as well as some territorial changes. I would say it's quite a big topic, so let's get started right away. With the start of the new offensive season, a clear picture of Russian planning along the front is now emerging. While many analyses look at individual battles or sections of the front, a much more structured pattern emerges at the operational level. Russia is currently operating along the entire front with 5 army groups, supplemented by a northern security group. This northern group serves less for conducting major offensives and mainly fulfills tasks such as border raids, harassment attacks on Ukrainian positions, and tying down Ukrainian forces. The goal is to pin down Ukrainian reserves in the north and prevent their redeployment to decisive areas. The actual offensive is carried out by the 5 army groups along the main front. These are formally organized and operate independently of each other, but as the operations progress, they will increasingly have to coordinate their actions in order to exploit operational breakthroughs. The main strategic objective of the Russian campaign in 2026 is considered to be the city of Kramatorsk, which is located here. The conditions for larger operations against this city are now largely in place. Kramatorsk, together with Sloviansk, forms the core of the Ukrainian defensive structure in the northern Donbass. The fall of these cities would significantly destabilize the Ukrainian front in the entire area. A secondary operational objective, on the other hand, is Porichia on the southern front. However, this axis was partially disrupted by Ukrainian counter-operations. As a result, the dynamics in that sector have changed, and Russia had to at least partially adjust its planning. The main striking force within the offensive is the Southern Army Group. It is expected to carry out most of the direct frontal assaults and accordingly to bear the highest losses. Its biggest obstacles at the moment remain the towns of Konstantinivka and Chasiv Yar. Both continue to form a crucial defensive line that blocks direct access to the Kramatorsk area. As long as these positions are not captured, a larger advance to the north remains severely limited. At the same time, Army Group Center is operating, directing its forces to the north, so a possible but rather unfavorable scenario would be in the foreground. Advance along the Dobropilya-Boinkol axis. Now that Russia has secured Pokrovsk, this place can now be used as a logistical and operational hub from which further offensives can be coordinated. The Western Army Group faces a particularly difficult task. In order to actually put pressure on Sloviansk in the north, they also have to cross a river. River crossings of this kind are militarily complex and involve very high risks. I know of a small river crossing on the Eastern Front where entire battalions were lost. And that was a small crossing. Just imagine what it would be like for an entire army group. The scale would be enormous. As an intermediate objective, the initial goal is therefore to capture the heights south of Sviatorisk, which in turn requires further preparatory operations. For Army Group Center and West, an important prerequisite for this is the so-called front isolation. Large parts of the front that are not directly involved in the main offensive must be kept stable so that Ukrainian forces cannot launch any counterattacks. River lines and natural terrain obstacles play an important role in this as they allow for relatively stable defensive sections. A very interesting strategic development is also emerging in the area around Kupiansk and Siversk. Russia currently seems to be deliberately prioritizing Siversk more, while Ukrainian pressure in the area around Kupiansk is being partly accepted. This approach indicates a deliberate strategic decision. Stability in a less decisive sector is being sacrificed to achieve operational advantages in an important front area. Meanwhile, there are many indications that Russia is not planning a single spectacular major offensive in 2026 as they had intended in previous years, but rather a multi-stage operation in which several army groups will apply pressure simultaneously and try to break through at some section. The main objective, however, remains the area around Kramatorsk-Kupiansk, whose fall would be fundamental for the Ukrainian defensive structure in the Donbass. With the end of the long winter and the beginning of the spring period, many military expectations are focused on a major operation in this area. Several developments along the front now also indicate that the fighting will increasingly concentrate on this section. Offensive operations have been ongoing for months near Sivers, likely as preliminary battles for a larger offensive. In this section, Russian forces have achieved the first limited territorial gains along the axis toward Sloviansk. At the same time, they continue to try to put pressure on the Ukrainian defensive lines and create the conditions for future advances. So what we are seeing now in terms of attacks is ultimately a preparation for later offensives. In the southern section, however, the situation remains largely complicated for Russia. Kostiantynivka remains a key obstacle. So far, Russian forces have neither been able to enter the city permanently nor seriously threaten the logistical supply routes of the Ukrainian garrison, even though this is always heavily promoted on Russian channels. As long as these communication lines stay open, the city will remain a stable part of Ukraine's defense. That means they are safe for now, as long as the Russians don't fundamentally change their offensive tactics here. The developments in the coming months could therefore determine whether Russia will be able to create the conditions for a larger operation against the cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. At the same time, it can be assumed that offensive activities will continue to take place in other sectors as well. This is especially likely in some areas around Orikhiv, that is, in the area of the Federal Republic. In the Bokrovsk area, along the Oskol axis, and basically everywhere, Ukrainian forces can be effectively tied down or operational reserves could be stretched. In the area around Nikiforovka, units of the 3rd Russian Army, especially the 85th Motorized Rifle Brigade, have been trying to break through the Ukrainian defenses for several weeks. The attacks are taking place at the junction between the 11th Corps under General Sitchenko and the Tactical Group Solidar under General Bratishko. The immediate goal of the Russian attacks is twofold. On the one hand, the Ukrainian defenses along the river are to be breached. On the other hand, Ukrainian forces are trying to defend themselves against Russian attacks, which are mainly taking place south of the area of Hill 270. These positions are held by the units of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade and represent an important tactical key position in the terrain, which we took a closer look at in some previous situation reports. After several days of intense fighting, Russian forces have so far only been able to achieve limited tactical gains. The 85th. The brigade managed to establish a bridgehead about 1 kilometer deep and 3 kilometers wide south of the river. This includes the village of Fedorivka Drusha and a small forested area on the southern edge, roughly between hills 229 and 236, which are marked in red here. As a result of the advance, a company of the 1st Mechanized Battalion of the Ukrainian 30th Mechanized Brigade, which is defending this section of the front, had to give up its position and withdraw to the forest strips along the M03 road, which is the connecting road between Bakhmut and Slavyansk, so you know roughly where we are. This new defensive line runs in the area of elevation 236, the capture of which is presumably the next objective of the Russian assault groups, as it forms an important observation and forward position in the terrain. However, the Russian attacks in the direction of Raya Oleksandrivka have been significantly slowed down over the past 2 weeks. Ukrainian counterattacks in the area of elevation 229 towards the center were carried out by units of the 30th Mechanized Brigade, as well as offensive actions by the 8th Battalion of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade from elevation 220 towards Lvivka were able to stop the Russian advance. As a result of these countermeasures, Ukrainian forces were able to partially push Russian sub-units out of the area around Lvivka. What is crucial here is that the Ukrainian side continues to control the dominant high ground around this area. This includes, in particular, elevations 220, 229, and 207, which are located in this area, and on top of which there is a fairly well-fortified Ukrainian stronghold in each case, even though it is currently unclear whether these are still permanently occupied. Between these elevations runs an undeveloped Ukrainian defensive line, which consists of anti-tank ditches, Dragon's Teeth, and other field fortifications. These installations greatly limit Russian reconnaissance and sabotage groups' movement and make further advances in the area harder. Overall, the situation in the area remains stable but highly contested. Russia was able to establish a limited bridgehead south of the river, but Ukrainian control over the surrounding heights and fortifications has so far prevented any further expansion of the advance. The battle for the high ground along the M03 road is therefore likely to play a central role in the further development of this section of the front in the coming weeks. And of course, I will continue to keep you informed about it. During the night, an oil depot in Lubyansk in Russia's Krasnodar region was hit by drones. Reports indicate that the facility was the target of an attack. There are no further details yet about possible damage or the cause of the strike. The location is in southern Russia and is part of a region where several logistically important energy and fuel facilities are located, which are extremely important for the local market and play a role both in civilian supply and in military infrastructure. No further official information has been released about the extent of the damage or the exact course of the attack. Russian channels are currently reporting a major drone attack on Moscow this year, which has apparently been ongoing for over 24 hours. According to official reports, 105 drones have been shot down so far. Due to the ongoing attacks, several airports in the Moscow area have also been temporarily restricted or closed to ensure the safety of civilian air traffic. Russian sources report more incoming drones as air defense stays active. The report, of course, indicates that the attacks are not meant to be a single wave, but rather successive rounds of attacks in order to increase the strain on air defense. And what we see here is also a very iconic image. Here we see an air defense unit on the Russian side with a very iconic building in the background. You all know what this is about. And yes, you can make fun of it, of course, but we also know that the Russians have built a very, very large air defense belt around the city, that is, around the capital Moscow, consisting of Panzer I systems, or the Berg system, as well as several other air defense measures. And such small mobile units are especially effective against drones. You don't waste big missiles or expensive rockets in this case, but you also don't waste large capacities. And you have a fairly mobile unit that can achieve its objectives with, let's say, relatively cheap ammunition, especially when there are only a few drones. As we know, however, the Ukrainians don't want to attack Moscow with drones in the future, but rather with ballistic missiles. The FP-7 or FP-9 would be the main options for that. You should also mention Ukrainian statements, of course. According to reports from Defense Express, Kiev was targeted for the first time by a Lancet drone, which is said to have had AI-assisted control. According to this, drones crashed near a monument on Maidan. The incident is quite remarkable since Lancet drones have so far mainly attacked vehicles, artillery, or radar positions, and have always been controlled by an operator. An operation against targets deep in the hinterland, especially in the Ukrainian capital, should indicate that Russia may be trying to expand the operational role of these systems. Lancet is a good drone. I haven't had anything negative to say about it yet, since although it is not improvised, it has already been in use for quite some time. It still belongs to, I would say, a very powerful drone, especially when you look at the price and performance. Previous reports said the drone was meant to hit the monument, which likely prevented serious harm to people. No further details about possible hits or damage have been given. If it turns out that it was actually AI-powered, as the Ukrainians claim, then that would indicate a further development of the system. And such technologies could enable drones to autonomously identify or approach targets even when the connection is disrupted. That could have been the case here as well. Imagine if the Russians had trained the drone specifically on this target, and the drone was then able to detect it itself during the flyover and also attack it. Now, of course, the Ukrainians have published that it was hit, which in turn confirms to the Russians that they were able to hit their target, if that really was the target, without having to control the drone themselves. This will be very interesting for the future, as such drones would be much more resilient to electronic countermeasures. A Russian military blogger is again reporting new measures within the Russian armed forces to control soldiers' communications. According to him, his units have been instructed not to use the messenger service Telegram anymore. We have also seen corresponding legislative proposals on this and certain requests as well. However, they are supposed to use the controlled state platform MAX, which is monitored by the Russian Domestic Intelligence Service, the Federal Security Service, and not only is it monitored what people send to each other, but even what you type on the keyboard is already being monitored, and MAX is also supposed to work beyond other apps. That means if it keeps running in the background, the Federal Security Service can also see what you type, for example, on WhatsApp or on other social media platforms, or generally on your phone. According to the blogger, military police units were regularly instructed to check soldiers' mobile phones to make sure that Telegram was no longer installed or being used. The background, of course, is that Telegram continues to play an important role in unofficial communication, leaks, and criticism within the Russian military scene. I get most of my information from the Russian side there. The blogger also says soldiers caught with Telegram on their phones face especially harsh consequences. In his post, he writes that those affected are allegedly sent on particularly dangerous assault missions, which are practically equivalent to one-way operations. It's impossible to independently verify if these threats are carried out systematically along the entire front. However, the reports fit a longer-term trend within the Russian armed forces to more strictly control information flows and restrict unofficial communication channels, especially Telegram. But Russian media also report that, for example, a university in Moscow has announced that it will refuse to give students their diplomas through the state online portal if they do not want to install the state-controlled app, MAX. MAX is considered a communication platform. The Federal Security Service oversees it and is enforcing it more as an alternative to services like Telegram. According to this, students were informed that access to certain state online services, including the issuance or retrieval of graduation documents, would be tied to the installation of this application. And those who don't install the app simply won't get a diploma and therefore won't graduate. So this measure fits into a very broad development that now no longer affects only the soldiers at the front, but also Russian citizens themselves. And the whole thing is being sold, if under a certain pretext. And Russia wants to show that they want to connect authorities, institutions, and users all through a single ecosystem to enable easier communication, smoother interactions with authorities, and immediate data availability and storage. And you can simply send them back and forth without having to rescan or resend anything, and everything would basically be stored locally. In theory, that's always quite good. That just makes sense logically. It's better than having 10 different apps or having to create 10 different accounts when everything comes together. But when the whole thing is controlled by the government, and especially by the SFSB, that's obviously pretty tough, especially if the app can also listen in on users. And I always find it very remarkable in this context, that's just my own opinion, in this case. Because in political debates, for example in Germany, it's always claimed that there's no freedom of speech here, because people here somehow confuse freedom of speech with immunity from punishment, while Russia is mentioned as a counterexample, because people say you're much freer there because you can say whatever you want and all sorts of things. But as always, the cases show exactly the opposite. In Russia, digital tools are increasingly not only recommended, but in some cases are actually made mandatory, and access to government services can depend on their use. Thank you to all subscribers, channel members, and the Algae Group. Special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Renicky from Radio Mayrhofer. Please subscribe, like, and comment. See you next report.